Wind moved through Briar Hollow as though it were searching for something misplaced. It ran the length of the main street, slipped between hitching posts, rattled the loose sign above the mercantile, and pressed its cold palm against every door, as if to ask who lived inside and what they were willing to admit. From a distance, the town appeared like many frontier settlements did. A handful of false front buildings and sober little houses set against a wide, merciless sky. The land surrounding it was pale and spare. Water was rationed by season and luck. A rail spur lay half a day's ride away, close enough to bring travelers and newspapers, far enough to keep Briar Hollow from being truly watched. But the town had something else that set it apart, though no one said so aloud. It had a silence that did not belong to nature. It was the silence of people deciding what not to know. On the morning the trouble truly began, the church bell did not ring. It was not Sunday. It was not a funeral. The bell remained still, and that, in Briar Hollow, was already a kind of message. If no one announced a thing, perhaps it would not become real. Nora Baines stepped out from behind the counter of her father's boarding house and looked down the street. She had been born in Missouri, raised on worn hymns and honest work, and brought west by a father who believed a new town meant a new start. That was the promise the frontier sold best, the chance to escape the name you had earned back east. Nora had lived in Briar Hollow long enough to know that new starts were real, but not free. They were purchased with heat, hunger, and the slow grinding fear that arrived whenever winter lingered too long. She watched men pass in ones and twos, cowhands, miners, ranchers, moving with eyes kept forward. Their greetings were shorter than usual. A nod replaced a word. A word was replaced by nothing at all. Something had changed overnight, like a storm that had not yet shown itself, but had turned the air metallic. Inside the boarding house, a pot of coffee simmered. The smell should have been comforting. It was not. Her father, Amos Baines, sat at a table with last week's paper spread open. He was a thin man, stooped from years of labor, with the cautious gaze of someone who had learned that trouble could be invited by speaking too freely. Nora set down 2 cups. "The street feels wrong," she said. Amos didn't look up. "It's just wind." "It isn't." At last he met her eyes, and in them she saw a warning of father's instinct to keep his daughter from learning the truth too directly. "They found a man behind the livery," Amos said quietly. Nora's stomach tightened. "Found him how?" Amos hesitated, then spoke with the same carefulness the town used when it wished to remain decent. Not breathing, Nora set her hand on the back of a chair to steady herself. Death was not unusual out west. Fever took children. Accidents took men. The land took anyone who underestimated it. But this was different. Not breathing behind the livery was not like not breathing in bed after a long illness. It carried the suggestion of decision. Who was it? She asked. Amos folded the paper and slid it away, as if removing words removed reality. Jed Sutter. Nora knew the name. Everyone did. Jed Sutter was not important the way wealthy men were important. He did not own land enough to put his name on a map. He did not have a business that controlled supplies. He was, instead, a man the town had agreed to barely see. A drifter who had settled down just enough to become familiar. A quiet worker who took odd jobs and slept in a shed behind the feed store. Jed had one quality that made towns uneasy. He asked questions. Not loudly, not with speeches, but with the stubborn habit of noticing what other people preferred to overlook. A month earlier, he had come into the boarding house for supper and said, in a mild voice, "A man ought not be made to pay twice for the same sack of flour." Nora had assumed it was a complaint about a storekeeper's mistake. Jed had shaken his head. Not mistake, habit. He had not explained further. And Nora, busy with plates and tiredness, had not pressed. Now he was dead behind the livery, and the town's wind seemed to carry his unfinished sentence down every board and nail. Nora went to the window again, and looked toward the sheriff's office. Sheriff Cal Hargrove stood outside, a heavy man with a heavy face, his hat pulled low. He had been elected less by admiration than by the town's desire for someone who looked like stability. His strength was not in quickness or bravery, but in familiarity. He was a man who could stand still for a long time and call it order. Two men spoke with him, close enough that Nora could not hear words. One of them was Leland Cross, the owner of Cross and Pike Mercantile, the nearest thing Briar Hollow had to a man of real influence. He supplied the town. He extended credit. He held accounts in his ledgers, the way a preacher held names in prayer. The other man was Reverend Silas Grant, the town's minister, whose sermons were gentle and whose eyes were often troubled. He had come west not for fortune, but for mission. He believed souls could be steadied in rough places. Nora watched as Leland Cross spoke, and Sheriff Hargrove nodded, not in agreement, but in surrender. The minister's hands moved as if in pleading. Then Cross looked down the street, briefly, and Nora felt the strange sensation of being seen not as a person, but as a circumstance. She stepped back from the window. In that moment, she understood something she had never named before. There were two towns living in Briar Hollow. One town spoke, the other town swallowed. One, the shape of fear by midday. Jed Sutter's death had become an object passed hand to hand like a hot coal. Everyone knew, and no one said. Men at the saloon kept their voices low. Women at the well-exchanged looks instead of words. The blacksmith hammered harder than usual, as if sound could drown thought. Nora walked toward the livery, careful not to appear as though she were going to witness. That was the first rule of Briar Hollow now. Do not appear too interested in truth. Near the livery, she found Mrs. Pearlie Dunn, an older woman with wide shoulders and a face that had lost softness to drought and grief. Pearlie had buried a husband years ago when a mine timber gave way. She had learned that the world did not ask permission before taking. Pearlie's eyes met Nora's, and Nora saw something there that felt like a warning and a request at once. "Don't go closer," Pearlie said. "Was it?" Nora began. Pearlie shook her head. "No one knows anything. That is what they've decided?" "Who decided?" Nora asked, though she already knew. Pearlie looked toward Cross and Pike, where Leland Cross's sign hung straight and proud. "Folks with ledgers," Pearlie said. "Folks with friends. Folks who don't have to wonder if they'll eat next week." Nora felt heat rise in her face, not anger only, but shame. Shame that she had lived beside this division and called it normal. Jed had enemies? Nora asked. Pearlie's mouth tightened. Jed had a tongue. That'll do. They stood in silence as a wagon rolled past too slowly. The driver's eyes remained forward, as if looking sideways might mark him. Nora thought of her father at the table, folding the paper away. She thought of the minister's troubled eyes. She thought of Sheriff Hargrove's bowed head. Fear in the West was not always loud. Often it was practical. It spoke in the language of meals, winters, and nets. And it could turn decent people into accomplices without ever asking them to commit a crime. 2. A town chooses its story. That evening, Sheriff Hargrove called a meeting in the church. The church in Briar Hollow was plain unpainted boards, long benches, windows that let in harsh light. It smelled of dust, old hymnals, and wax. It was a place built not for beauty, but for endurance. Men filled the benches first. Women stood along the walls. Children were kept at home, as though innocence could be preserved by distance. Nora sat beside her father, feeling his tension as if it were her own. Sheriff Hargrove stood at the front with Reverend Grant. Leland Cross sat in the first row, hands folded, posture calm. A man who expected the world to arrange itself around him. Hargrove cleared his throat. "Jed Sutter was found behind the livery this morning," he said. "We have reason to believe it was an accident." A murmur moved through the room. Not surprise agreement, relief, A story offered, ready-made, easy to swallow. Nora looked around. Faces nodded as if a lie were a blanket. Reverend Grant's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His eyes flicked across, then away. Nora felt something cold in her chest. Even the minister was learning the town's true religion. Sheriff Hargrove continued. No cause to start rumors. No cause to stir trouble. We are a peaceable town. A man in the back, a ranch hand named Willard Boone, stood up. He was tall and raw-boned, his hands scarred by rope and weather. With respect, Sheriff, Boone said, voice steady. Jed didn't fall the kind of way a man falls by accident. Silence snapped tight. Hargrove's expression hardened not with anger, but with panic. Leland Cross turned his head slightly, like a man noticing a fly. Boone kept going, despite the weight of eyes. I saw marks, he said. Saw what looked like dragging. I ain't saying I know who did it. I'm saying we ought to look. A long breath moved through the room. Nora saw men glance at one another, calculating. Not justice. Risk. Sheriff Hargrove's voice turned firm, almost pleading. Willard, sit down. Don't make trouble where there is none. Boone's jaw tightened. He looked around, seeking even one ally. None rose. Nora felt the moment like a knife, not because Boone was alone, but because the town made him alone. Boone sat back down, slowly, his shoulders stiff. Reverend Grant finally spoke, voice soft. Let us pray for peace and for Yet's soul. Nora wanted to stand, to ask why a town could pray so easily and speak so little. Her father's hand pressed her wrist under the bench. A quiet command. Not now. Nora looked at Amos Baines and saw not cowardice, but terror. That was when she understood the true strength of fear. It could wear a father's love like a bridle. 3. The ones who cannot afford silence. After the meeting, people left quickly, as though remaining in the church too long might lead to conversation. Outside, under a sky scattered with hard stars, Nora found Reverend Grant standing alone near the steps. His shoulders were hunched, not from age, but from burden. Reverend, Nora said. He turned. His face held shame and something like pleading. Miss Baines, he replied. Do you believe it was an accident? She asked. The minister hesitated. His silence lasted long enough to be an answer. I believe, he said carefully, that this town is frightened. That is not what I asked. Reverend Grant exhaled, and the breath looked like surrender. No, he admitted. I do not believe it was an accident. Then why? Nora began, then stopped. She already knew. Fear. That's winter. The minister's eyes glistened, but he did not allow tears. Tears were too honest. There are widows here, he said. There are children. There are men who owe Mr. Cross money. There are families that will not survive if the mercantile closes credit. Is that peace? Nora asked. Grant looked down at his hands. It is a kind of survival. Nora felt anger rise, not like fire, but like a slow heat that made the world sharp. And Jed? She asked. What was his survival worth? The minister did not answer. From across the street came laughter from the saloon too loud for the hour, too forced. Nora saw men inside, faces brightened by drink, making noise because noise was easier than truth. A town divided by fear and silence did not always look divided. Often it looked busy. 4. Yet's sister. 2 days after Yet's death, a woman arrived in town on a tired horse. She wore a plain dress, dust-stained, and carried herself with the stiffness of long travel and longer grief. She dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, and the street watched her like a jury. Her name was Eleanor Sutter, Yet's sister. Nora saw her first from the boarding house porch and felt something shift. Eleanor did not look like someone coming to beg. She looked like someone coming to weigh a town's soul. Eleanor demanded to see the body. Sheriff Hargrove tried to delay, tried to soften, tried to guide her into the offered story. It was an accident, ma'am. he said, voice practiced. Eleanor looked at him as if he were a door she intended to open. "I will decide what it was," she replied. Her voice did not rise. It did not threaten. It did something more unsettling. It refused to cooperate with comfort. Word spread quickly. People watched from windows. Men gathered in small knots, whispering. Cross and Pike's door opened and closed, as if decisions were being passed inside like currency. That evening, Eleanor came to the boarding house seeking a room. Nora's father hesitated when he saw the name on her trunk. "Ma'am," Amos said, cautious. "I'm near full." Eleanor met his eyes. "I'll pay." Amos's gaze flicked toward the street, toward the mercantile, toward the invisible cords of debt and dependence. Nora stepped forward before her father could speak again. "We have a room," Nora said. Amos looked at her, shocked. Nora felt his fear press against her like a hand, but she held her ground. Eleanor nodded once, not grateful, but acknowledging. That night, after the boarding house quieted, Eleanor sat in the kitchen with Nora, a lantern between them. "You knew my brother," Eleanor said. "I knew him enough to remember his face," Nora replied, "and to know the town will try to forget it." Eleanor studied her. "Why?" Nora struggled for words. How did one explain a fear that was also hunger? A silence that was also winter? "Because Mr. Cross owns half the town without owning it on paper," Nora said. "Because the sheriff is afraid. Because people are tired." Eleanor's mouth tightened. Tired is no excuse. Nora felt the sting of that. "It may not be," she said. "But it is true." Eleanor leaned back. In the lamplight, her face looked older than her years. "My brother wrote to me," she said. "He said he'd found something, said he'd made a record. Then his letter stopped." "A record?" Nora asked. Eleanor nodded. "He said names, numbers, receipts. He said men were being charged twice. He said some were losing their land because they couldn't read the ledgers." Nora thought of Cross's calm posture in the church, of his ledgers neat, precise, merciless. "Where is the record?" Nora asked. Eleanor's gaze hardened. "That is what I came to find." 5. The pressure begins the next morning. Leland Cross walked into the boarding house as if it were his property. He removed his hat with polite control and looked at Amos Baines with something that could be mistaken for kindness. "Amos," Cross said, "I hear you have company." Amos's voice was thin. A room came open. Cross's eyes moved to Nora, then back to Amos. "This town is unsettled," Cross said. "It would be a shame if rumors grew." Nora felt her pulse in her throat. "We are not spreading rumors," Amos replied. Cross smiled faintly. "No, of course not. I know you to be a sensible man." His gaze lingered on Nora again, and Nora felt as though she were being measured. "Miss Baines," Cross said, "your father is a good man. He has always paid what he owes. That is worth protecting." The words were smooth. The meaning was rough. Nora understood. Cross was not threatening her with fists or guns. He was threatening her with flour, with lamp oil, with the future. That was how power often operated on the frontier, quietly, economically, without leaving visible marks. After Cross left, Amos sank into a chair as though he had been struck. "You should not have offered her room," he said, voice strained. Nora's heart ached. "Father." "You don't understand," he whispered. "If Cross closes our account, we cannot keep this place. We cannot buy supplies. We cannot breathe," Nora finished. Amos stared at her, eyes wet with fear. Nora realized then that moral courage was not measured only by the size of a man's heart, but by the thickness of his pantry. That knowledge did not excuse silence, but it explained it. 6. The search for what Ched left behind Eleanor insisted they look for Yet's belongings. Sheriff Hargrove resisted at first, claiming procedures, claiming respect. But pressure from a grieving sister was harder to dismiss than a drifter's life had been. They allowed Eleanor and Nora to go to Yet's shed behind the feed store. It was small, crude, and clean in the way a poor man's home can be clean, because order is the only dignity left. A blanket folded, a tin cup, a few books with worn covers, a pencil. Nora felt ashamed again. Jed had lived beside them, and the town had treated him like a temporary stain. Eleanor knelt and examined the floorboards, the corners, the seams of the wall. She moved like a woman used to not being given what she needed. In the corner, under a loose plank, she found a cloth-wrapped bundle. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Inside was a ledger, not crosses, but a copy. Pages of careful handwriting, names and dates, notes about prices and debts, small marks beside certain entries like warnings. Nora's breath caught. Eleanor's face hardened into grief, sharpened by purpose. "This is it," she said. Then behind them, a voice spoke softly. "You ought not have that." They turned. Sheriff Hargrove stood in the doorway, hat in hand, eyes troubled. He did not look angry. He looked afraid. Nora felt cold. "Sheriff," she said, "you came here to help us." Hargrove's gaze flicked toward the street, toward where men could be watching. "I came to keep the peace," he said. Eleanor rose slowly, ledger held close. "Peace is not the same as justice," she replied. Hargrove swallowed. "Mr. Cross will say this is theft." "It is truth," Eleanor said. The sheriff's shoulders sagged. "You don't understand what you're bringing down on this town," he murmured. Nora stepped forward. "We are already under it," she said. "We have simply been pretending not to feel the weight." Hargrove looked at Nora, as if she had become someone else in a moment. He moved aside slowly, as though making space for a decision he could not prevent. They left with the ledger, and the town watched them go. 7. The town splits that night. The boarding house felt different, as if the walls knew. Men who rented rooms walked more quietly. A woman who usually spoke freely kept her eyes lowered. Nora heard murmurs like insects in the corners. Eleanor and Nora sat in the small upstairs room, reading by lamplight. The ledger held names of men who had paid more than they owed. It held evidence of goods, priced one way for one family, another way for another. It held notes of interest, added quietly. It held the slow theft that could take a man's farm without ever spilling a drop of blood. "It's starvation done politely," Nora whispered. Eleanor nodded. "It is still starvation." In the morning, 2 things happened. First, Reverend Grant came to the boarding house, face pale. "I heard you have something," he said. Nora studied him. "Will you speak?" she asked. "Or will you pray quietly again?" The minister flinched. "I have failed," he admitted, "and I am frightened. But I can no longer pretend that fear is virtue." Second, Amos Baines received a note from Cross and Pike. Credit suspended, defective immediately. Her father sat at the table, staring at the paper as if it were a death notice. "We're ruined," he whispered. Nora felt her chest tighten with guilt. She had chosen truth, and now her father would pay. Eleanor touched Nora's shoulder. "That is how it works," she said softly. "They make righteousness expensive." Nora swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Eleanor looked out the window toward the main street. "We make silence more expensive," she replied. 8. The turning point. Speaking costs, but silence costs more. They called another meeting, this time not in the church, but in the open air, in front of the mercantile itself. Eleanor insisted that truth should be spoken where the lies were written. People gathered in uneasy clusters. Some came out of curiosity. Some came because they had been wronged. Some came because they feared what would happen if they did not show. Leland Cross stood on his porch, calm as a man in church, flanked by 2 employees. Sheriff Hargrove hovered nearby, uncertain. Reverend Grant stood among the crowd, hands clenched as though holding himself upright. Eleanor stepped forward with the ledger. "My brother died," she said, voice carrying without shouting. "He died after he began writing down what this town has been paying for twice." A ripple moved through the crowd. Men shifted. Women pressed lips together. Eyes darted. Cross spoke smoothly. "Ma'am, grief makes people imagine villains." Eleanor did not turn her head. "Grief also makes people see clearly," she said. She opened the ledger and read names aloud. Walter Klein, the Morrow family. Mrs. Dunn, a miner named Peake, a ranch hand named Boone. As each name was spoken, faces tightened. Some with shame, some with anger, some with fear. Nora watched her father. Amos's hands shook. His own name was there. Cross's smile faded into something thinner. "This is stolen property," Cross said. "And it is slander." And Reverend Grant stepped forward. "I have seen men turned away hungry," the minister said, voice trembling but loud enough. "I have told myself it was not my business. I have called it peace. I was wrong." The crowd stirred. Nora felt her breath catch. A minister's confession was not just a word. It was permission for others to admit what they knew. Willard Boone, who had stood alone in the church, stepped forward now, and his voice did not shake. "I paid for flour I never received," Boone said. "And when I questioned it, I was told to be grateful I had credit at all." Pearlie Dunn raised her chin. "My husband died in the mine," she said. "And afterward Cross added interest to my account every month, like grief was a luxury." More voices rose, careful, then stronger. A town that had swallowed began to speak, and speaking changed the air. Cross lifted a hand as if to quiet them, and the gesture looked suddenly like what it was. Ownership assumed. Sheriff Hargrove stepped forward, face strained. "This will turn ugly," he warned, but his voice held less authority than before. He sounded like a man begging the tide to stop. Eleanor looked at him. "It has been ugly," she said. "Only hidden." Cross's eyes narrowed. "You are endangering this town," he said. Nora felt something break open inside her, an old obedience cracking. "No," she said, stepping forward. Her voice surprised even her. "You are endangering this town. You have made us afraid of one another. You have made us quiet. You have made decent people into liars." The crowd turned. Nora felt every gaze. She felt the risk. Her father looked at her with terror, and then slowly with something else. He stood, weak but upright. "My daughter speaks true," Amos said, "and I have been silent too long." Nora's eyes burned. She had wanted her father's protection. Instead, she received his courage. It was rarer and more costly. Leland Cross looked at Amos as though a debt had become betrayal. "You will regret this," Cross said softly. Amos's voice trembled. "I regret plenty already." 9. The aftermath. Consequences of breaking silence that day did not end with a neat resolution. The West did not offer such endings. The truth did not clean itself like a kitchen after supper. It left stains. Cross left town within a week quietly, taking what money and papers he could. Some said he fled. Others said he simply moved to a larger place where he could begin again with new faces and the same habits. Power, when threatened, often did not fight openly. It relocated, but he did not leave without damage. Credit vanished. Supplies became scarce. Families who depended on Cross's ledgers found themselves exposed, as if a blanket had been pulled away in winter. A few men cursed Eleanor and Nora for bringing trouble. A few accused Reverend Grant of turning faith into politics. Sheriff Hargrove resigned, claiming illness, though everyone knew it was shame. Briar Hollow did not become a better town overnight. It became a town forced to look at itself. Nora's father lost the boarding house within a season, not because he was wrong, but because righteousness did not fill shelves. He tried to keep going, took work where he could, and Nora worked beside him until her hands cracked. Eleanor stayed longer than she planned. She helped families untangle debts. She wrote letters to a county office seeking some oversight. She spoke to men who had never been asked their story. And still, the damage remained not only in empty pantries, but in relationships. People who had kept silent for years now looked at one another with suspicion. Who knew? Who benefited? Who watched? Who waited? Silence, once broken, revealed the cost of having kept it. One cold evening, Nora walked with Reverend Grant beyond the last houses, where the prairie opened wide and the sky seemed too large for human mistakes. "I thought truth would feel like relief," Nora said. The minister's face held the same sorrow he carried at the church steps. "Truth feels like winter at first," he replied. "It strips things down. It makes you see what you have and what you do not." Nora looked out at the land. "Was Jed worth it?" she asked softly. Grant's eyes sharpened with pain. "He was a man," he said. "And that question is part of what the West has done to us. It makes us measure human life against flour." Nora felt tears rise, but she did not let them fall. Not because she was hard, but because she was learning how to hold grief without turning it into surrender. 10. The reflective end. What the West cost spring came late. It came as it often did, without apology. Mud replaced dust. The creek ran fuller. The cottonwoods along the bend showed small green hands of new leaves. One morning, Nora went to the creek alone. She stood where Jed had once been seen, where the ribbon had been found, where the town's silence had first tightened into shape. The water moved over stones, indifferent to names and blame. It did not remember. It only continued. Nora thought about Briar Hollow's divide, not a line drawn on the street, but a division inside people, the part that wanted to be decent and the part that wanted to survive. On the frontier, survival was not an abstract word. It was food. It was warmth. It was a child's cough in winter. It was the fear that one wrong decision could end a family line. And because survival was so sharp, men like Cross could use it, turn it into leverage, into quiet cruelty, into a system that did not need gunfire to break people. Briar Hollow had learned, in the hardest way, that lawlessness was not only in open violence. It was in the careful, polite theft of dignity. It was in the habit of looking away. It was in the bargain people made with their own conscience. If I stay quiet, I can keep my life intact. But no life stayed intact forever under that bargain. Silence spread like drought. It hardened hearts. It isolated neighbors. It made a town into a collection of separate fears rather than a community. Breaking silence did not create an easy peace. It created consequence. It created hunger. It created conflict. Yet it also created something the frontier needed as badly as water: accountability. That year, Briar Hollow remained a hard place. It lost some people. It gained no fame. No one built a monument for Jed Sutter. No song was written for Nora Baines, for Amos, for Reverend Grant, for Eleanor. The Old West rarely gave monuments to those who fought quietly against ordinary corruption. But in small ways, the town changed. A new mercantile opened under different ownership, run by a man who knew the danger of ledgers kept in secret. A committee formed to witness accounts and keep prices posted. Neighbors began sharing tools again, not because they were suddenly noble, but because they had learned what it cost to let fear rule. Nora never forgot Yet's name, nor did she forget the faces of those who stayed silent in the church. She did not hold those memories as weapons. She held them as lessons. Out there, redemption did not come like a sunrise that made everything gold. It came like a fire tended in wind-small, vulnerable, demanding constant care. And when the wind swept through Briar Hollow again, through boards and signs and fences, it did what wind always did. It carried dust. It carried seed. It carried stories. Some stories were told loudly, polished into legend. Those were easy to repeat. But the stories that shaped a town's soul were spoken more quietly at kitchen tables, beside wells, On porch steps late at night, when a person admitted to another person what they had feared to say before. In the end, that was the human cost of the Old West. Not only what the land demanded of the body, but what fear demanded of the conscience. The frontier asked people to decide over and over whether they would live by silence or by truth-knowing, and either choice carried its own kind of hunger. And Briar Hollow learned what many places learn too late. A town can survive drought. It can survive winter. It can even survive grief. But a town divided by fear and silence pays in something harder to replace than flour or timber. It pays in its ability to remain human.